Some stories are so dark that even time refuses to carry them forward. They hide in the cracks of history, whispered only in the places where pain once lived. And in the slave quarters of mid-19th century Alabama, there was one name that people said with a shaking breath. Not a white overseer, not a cruel plantation master, but a free black man who learned how to turn fear into fortune. Before we enter this forgotten nightmare, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing because stories like this were buried for a reason. Part 1. Tuscaloosa County, Alabama was a place where the Black Warrior River moved like a long dark vein between fields of cotton. The soil was rich and black, and the wealth of the region was built on the backs of men and women who had no say in their own lives. Plantation houses rose proudly across the landscape, while small shacks for enslaved people stood far behind them like silent reminders of suffering. Yet the most disturbing story from that land did not begin in a grand house or a deep forest. It began with a man who should have been a symbol of hope. His name was George Crow, a man born in chains who earned his freedom only to build something worse than any enslaved person could have imagined. George owned a small property 8 miles north of Tuscaloosa. It sat near the river, almost hidden among tall cypress trees with heavy branches that hung low like tired arms. The house was simple, made of plain wood, and the porch faced the quiet water. Anyone passing by would have believed it was just a modest cotton farm. And that illusion was exactly what George wanted. George acquired the land in December of 1842. The official records painted him as nothing more than a free black man trying to survive in a world where his very existence made white neighbors uneasy. Some watched him with suspicion. Others ignored him entirely. But in the slave quarters across the county, his name traveled like a cold wind. People did not know if he was a hero or a traitor. And that uncertainty became the greatest tool he would ever use. George was 35 years old with broad shoulders shaped by years of forced labor. His voice was soft and calm, almost comforting. His ability to read and write made him dangerous in a world where enslaved people were punished for holding a book. His intelligence drew people in. His manner inspired trust, and trust would become the weapon he held closest. For several months after buying his land, George lived quietly. He planted just enough cotton to keep the neighbors satisfied. But those who watched closely noticed something strange. George traveled often. He rode long distances. He stayed away for days at a time. When questioned, he always answered politely but vaguely. He had business to attend to. He had errands. He had obligations. The truth surfaced slowly. It began in May of 1843 when a man named Thomas escaped from Riverside Plantation. Thomas was clever. He knew the land. He knew the woods. Some believed he might reach freedom. His master, Charles Brennan, offered a reward of $300, a fortune in that time. Many men began searching for Thomas, but George found him first. 3 days after the escape, George delivered Thomas back to Brennan. Bound, exhausted, defeated, landowners across Tuscaloosa County took notice. A free black man who could track fugitives was a rare and valuable tool. George was paid without question. And soon other plantation owners came to him with their own problems. But in the slave quarters, the whispers grew darker. People said Thomas had been seen near George's property before he was captured. They said the man had gone to George for help because he believed a free black man would protect him. They said George returned him instead. These claims were whispered in the dark and spoken with trembling voices. No one could say it aloud. Between 1843 and 1845, George captured 18 runaways. He never needed violence. He used words. He used patience. He understood the thoughts of desperate people because he had once been one of them. Landowners learned to rely on him. When a slave questioned authority or tried to inspire others, George was called. He visited the quarters, talked to the people, offered them comfort, and then delivered their names to the masters. Those men and women were later punished, sold, or disappeared entirely. George grew wealthy from these deals. He also gained something more valuable: influence. White landowners trusted him, even respected him, a rare and dangerous position for a free black man in Alabama. George used that trust to build something hidden from everyone's eyes. In August of 1845, a new opportunity appeared. Holly Ridge, a 50-acre farm far north of Tuscaloosa, went up for sale. It had been abandoned after the owners went bankrupt. The land was isolated near the Sips River, surrounded by dense woods. Garrett Lynch, a gambler with a violent streak, bought the property. But those who knew the truth whispered that George was the real owner. He simply needed a white man's name on the papers so that no one would ask questions. Holly Ridge would soon become the heart of George's nightmare. He began sending people there. Not the valuable runaways he returned for large rewards. He sent the rebels, the talkers, the troublemakers, the ones no master wanted back. These people vanished into the woods of Holly Ridge. No documents, no witnesses, no traces. Fear spread like sickness. People began saying the worst thing in the county was not the whip or the overseer. It was the free black man by the Black Warrior River. George did not just catch runaways. He bought them, broke them, resold them for profit. He built an empire of suffering in the shadows. By the time the year ended, his transformation was complete. And his hunger for power had only begun. Part 2 will continue the rise of George Crow and the terrifying secrets of Holly Ridge. Part 2, The Price of Hope. Hook. Some betrayals strike like a blade. Others arrive with a smile, a warm voice, and a promise that feels like salvation. The people who lived through the nightmare of slavery believed the worst danger came from the overseer's whip or the master's anger. But the truth was far darker. The cruelest wounds came from the people they trusted. Before we continue this disturbing story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe because the past still has shadows we must face. Part 2. Moses had lived almost his entire life under the rule of the Brennan estate, which later passed to James Whitfield after the old master's death. Whitfield saw everything on his land as profit. Cotton fields, livestock, tools, even people. Moses was different from most. He was a blacksmith, skilled enough to repair tools, forge weapons, and fix horseshoes with the strength of his hands alone. That talent made him worth $1,200 on the market. But value meant nothing to Moses. The only thing he wanted was freedom. There was a law, rarely honored, that allowed an enslaved person to buy his own freedom. Most masters ignored it. Most slaves never even attempted it. But Whitfield once mentioned that he might consider selling Moses for $400. The number sounded impossible, but Moses held onto it like a lifeline. Every Sunday, he worked for outside clients. He repaired small tools. He made custom pieces. People paid him. Whitfield took almost everything but allowed him to keep a few tiny percentages. Pennies that slowly collected. 6 long years passed. Moses worked 16 and sometimes 18 hours a day. His hands were covered in blisters that turned into scars. His back ached constantly, but he endured. Every coin he saved represented one step closer to freedom. At last, in the spring of 1849, he had done it. He had saved $340. Only 60 more remained. Victory felt close enough to touch. Then Whitfield found the money. He discovered it under the forge floor during a routine inspection. When he opened the small metal can hidden beneath the dirt, he found the fortune Moses had built with blood, sweat, and hope. The law was clear. A slave could not own property. The coins legally belonged to Whitfield. The master pocketed everything without regret. Moses begged. He reminded Whitfield of the promise. He explained the years of work. Whitfield denied ever making the offer. He accused Moses of stealing and ordered 20 lashes. The whip cut deep. The pain was unbearable. The betrayal was far worse. Those $340 had been the closest Moses had ever come to tasting freedom, and they were gone. Most men would have broken. Moses did not. He began again with even greater determination. This time he hid the money in a place Whitfield would never dare to inspect. The slave cemetery. He buried the coins near his mother's grave. It felt like a sacred hiding place, protected by memory and sorrow. 2 more years of brutal labor followed. The work was heavier. The pain was worse. His body weakened faster than before. Yet he refused to stop. By June of 1851, he had saved $320. Not the full $400, but enough to try again. This time he had a new plan. He would not trust Whitfield. Rumors had reached him through a house servant during Sunday market. Rumors of a free black man who helped enslaved people find legal paths to freedom. Some said he had connections. Others said he negotiated with white masters on behalf of the oppressed. There were even whispers that he arranged freedom purchases. His name was George Crow. On the night of June 12, Moses made his decision. Under the cover of darkness, he rode 22 miles to George's property. In his pocket he carried everything he owned. $320 in worn coins. 8 years of hope held in the palm of his hand. George welcomed him with surprising warmth. He offered water, simple food, and a safe place to rest. He listened to Moses's story with gentle eyes and a voice filled with compassion. He nodded at the right moments. He asked thoughtful questions. He sounded like salvation. Moses felt his fear melt away. George promised to help. He said he knew Whitfield personally. He claimed he could negotiate Moses's freedom. He said that with his influence, he could convince Whitfield to accept the $320. Moses wanted to believe. After everything he had suffered, kindness felt heavenly. George told him to rest for 2 days while he made the arrangements. Moses handed over the money for safekeeping. George placed it in a locked box. The relief Moses felt was overwhelming. He slept deeply for the first time in years. He ate without rushing. He imagined himself walking freely under the Alabama sun. His future seemed bright for the first time in his life. George visited him occasionally, always calm, always encouraging, always speaking of progress in the negotiation. On the third morning, George rode out toward Riverside Plantation. Moses waited, filled with hope. But George did not go to negotiate freedom. He went to sell Moses. He told Whitfield that Moses had escaped and was hiding on the property of a free black man. He claimed Moses carried $320 that he must have stolen. He offered to capture him quietly, without causing embarrassment. The price for the information and the capture was $150. Whitfield agreed instantly. $150 was nothing compared to Moses's true value. And Whitfield would recover the $320 as well. It was a perfect profit. That afternoon, George returned to Moses and said the negotiation was almost complete. He told him Whitfield wanted to meet him the next day to finalize everything. Moses believed him. He went to sleep imagining the moment he would hear the words he had waited for all his life. During the night, while he slept peacefully, George tied his hands and feet. Moses woke at dawn to the sight of James Whitfield entering the room with 2 armed overseers. Horror filled his chest. Not one word was needed. He was taken back to Riverside. The coins were returned to Whitfield. The $150 went to George. The betrayal was complete. George Crow walked away with $470. More money than Moses could have earned in a decade. And Moses returned to a punishment so severe that the screams echoed across the fields. Part 3 will continue with the horrors that follow as George expands his empire of fear. Part 3, rewritten in horror, simple, Napoleon Hill-style clarity. Engaging hook. Some stories vanish into the earth like bones swallowed by the swamp. But in Alabama, one name crawled back again and again, whispered by slaves who feared the night more than death. It was not the name of a master or an overseer. It was the name of a man who smiled while breaking souls. A man who sold hope the way others sold cotton. And part 3 of this story reveals how far he was willing to go. Part 3, The Breaking Grounds of Holly Ridge. Whitfield believed punishment erased rebellion. So when Moses died hanging from his own chain in the forge, Whitfield claimed the matter settled. Property lost, money kept, order restored. But the slaves of the region did not forget. They whispered Moses's name like a warning. And another name followed close behind it. The name of the man who had betrayed him. George Crow. A man trusted by the desperate. A man who never missed a chance to turn suffering into silver. His reputation slithered across Alabama until it reached a place few people dared to speak of. A place hidden behind thick vines and crooked oak roots. A place where the ground was soft enough to swallow secrets whole. Holly Ridge, 18 miles north of Tuscaloosa, tucked between the Sipsey River and the Black Warrior's muddy bends, Holly Ridge looked like ordinary farmland from a distance. Up close, it was something else entirely. It was a place built to erase people, not grow crops. The owner on paper was Garrett Lynch, a young white man with too much anger and too many debts. George chose him for those reasons. Lynch needed money. George needed a shield. Together they built a machine that did not grow cotton, sugar, or corn. It grew obedience. Lynch followed orders without hesitation. He built devices that hurt without leaving marks buyers could complain about. He invented punishments that hollowed out the mind long before they broke the body. Holly Ridge became a place where slaves arrived with names and left as something less. The first method was the sweatbox. A wooden coffin shaped like a cube. A person could crouch but never stand or lie down. Under the Alabama sun the heat inside could climb past 90 degrees. Slaves locked inside fainted or vomited until they had nothing left to expel. Some woke confused. Some did not wake at all. Those who survived never questioned orders again. The second method was the iron gag. A cruel metal clamp with small spikes that bit into the tongue. It made eating almost impossible. Talking was torture. Over days, the mouth swelled, cracked, and bled. Pain became a constant companion. But when buyers later examined the slave's back, they found no whipping scars. No evidence of mistreatment, only silence. There was also soil burial. Victims dropped into pits up to their necks and left exposed under the sun. Ants marched across their faces. Mosquitoes feasted on their eyelids. Their legs cramped under the weight of packed wet dirt. They could not swat a single fly. They could not wipe a single tear. Some stared straight ahead until their eyes burned. The swamp watched them without pity. Chains were another favorite, 40 pounds on each ankle. Every step tore wounds that festered. They were not meant to escape. They were meant to remember. Between 1847 and 1852, 34 slaves passed through Holly Ridge. 27 were sold again for higher prices after their spirits were broken. 7 never left. Lynch said they escaped or died of fever. But the fishermen along the Black Warrior River told a different story. They found heavy chains half buried in mud. They found stains that river water could not wash away. Then came Sarah. Sarah was 32, strong, determined, and dangerous in the eyes of her master Philip Payne. When Payne mentioned selling her oldest daughters, Sarah made a desperate choice. She packed what she could and fled with her 3 girls, aged 9, 7, and 4. It was impossible to outrun patrols while protecting children. They were captured within 3 days. George found them hiding in an abandoned barn. He entered gently, carrying food and water. He spoke softly, promising understanding, promising safety, promising a future where her daughters stayed with her. Sarah believed because she needed to believe. George bought all 4 for $150. Not to save them, to sell them. He sold the oldest girl to Alabama for $350. The second to Mississippi for $300. The youngest to New Orleans for $400. Sarah watched each wagon drive away. She begged until her voice cracked. She screamed until she fell to her knees. She clawed at the dirt until her fingers bled. Then George turned to her. Not with comfort, but with the truth. He wanted her to understand her powerlessness fully, completely, without mercy. A broken spirit sold better than a rebellious one. 6 weeks in Holly Ridge did the rest. Sarah shrank to 105 pounds. Sweatbox, chains, dehydration, starvation, hair falling out in handfuls. Body trembling, eyes empty. George sold her to Mississippi for $800. His total profit for the family reached $1,700. 4 lives turned into numbers with stunning ease. Jason came next, a quiet field hand at Oakwood Plantation. He heard whispers of a planned escape. 6 men planning to follow the river under the cover of a new moon. Jason was not invited. They thought he was too fearful. George arrived days later. He had a gift for spotting weakness. Jason's eyes told him everything. When George offered him freedom for information, Jason broke. He revealed every detail. The plan, the route, the names. The conspirators were captured, punished brutally, sold or separated. Jason received $500 as a reward. He held it like it was the sun itself. He believed his life was finally beginning. But George had already made arrangements with Morrison. Jason would not be freed. Jason would be sold. Because a man who betrays once can betray again. Morrison wanted him gone. George agreed. Jason cried when the truth came. He begged on his knees. He reminded George of the promise. George took back the money and sold him to Texas for $700. He vanished into the West. A silent man. A used tool. A ghost in chains. Hannah followed. 8 months pregnant. Terrified that Whitfield would sell her newborn. She fled. George found her. Promised safety. Bought her cheap. Waited 12 days. Then sold her newborn daughter to Montgomery for $350. Sold Hannah to Mississippi for $600. Her scream echoed through Holly Ridge for hours. Even motherhood could be turned into profit. George never visited Holly Ridge when outsiders were present. Lynch handled everything. George stayed in the shadows. Counting money. Selecting new victims. Planning the next acquisition. Because for George Crow, cruelty was not an accident. It was a business model. And business was good. Part 4. The House That Devoured Voices. Engaging hook. Some plantations hid their sins in the fields. Others buried them under the river mud. But Holly Ridge hid its darkness inside the walls themselves. People said that if you pressed your ear to the wood at night, you could hear voices. Not whispers. Not cries. Voices that remembered every person who ever begged for mercy inside that house. Part 4 reveals why even the bravest slave hunters refused to stay there after sundown. Part 4. The Return to Riverside. 3 weeks had passed since Hannah was sold and her newborn stolen. Holly Ridge had grown quieter, as if the land itself was tired of swallowing sorrow. Garrett Lynch walked with a stiff limp after a mule kick, but his temper burned hotter than ever. George Crow had not visited since early spring. He always came when there was money to collect or misery to create. But now the summer sun was high, and the air felt heavy with secrets. One humid morning, a rider approached Holly Ridge. Dust rose behind him like a long dragging tail. Garrett squinted into the sunlight and recognized the figure almost immediately. George Crow had returned. He arrived with the same warm smile, the same calm voice, the same gentle pat on Garrett's shoulder. But his eyes felt colder. Calculating. Watching everything like a man observing a chessboard. Inside the main house, he studied the ledgers carefully. The numbers pleased him. More profit. More turnover. More broken spirits to reshape and resell. But George had not returned only for business. He had come because something was happening back at Riverside. Something dangerous. Something involving a name everyone thought had already vanished into the grave. Moses. Not Moses himself, but the echo of his story. Rumors spread that a slave from Lakeshore saw the punishment. Rumors spread that Whitfield stole Moses's money and then lied. Rumors spread that Moses did not die by suicide, as Whitfield claimed, but was strangled and hung to appear that way. Rumors drew attention. Attention was dangerous. And danger cost money. George needed to protect Whitfield because a scandal involving Riverside would expose his own dealings. If Whitfield burned, George burned with him. So he rode to Riverside the next day to investigate. The plantation looked normal at first. Cotton fields quiet, trees swaying, workers bent over rows in the heat. Yet something felt different. The slaves moved with tension in their shoulders. Their eyes shifted too quickly. Whitfield's overseer, Mr. Hodge, watched them fiercely as if expecting an attack. Inside the house, Whitfield greeted George with forced enthusiasm. Sweat covered his forehead although the room was cool. Something in his voice trembled. George sat across from him and waited. Whitfield tried casual conversation, but George kept his gaze steady. Eventually Whitfield caved and told the truth. Someone was spreading Moses's story. A field hand at Lakeshore. A woman named Miriam. She claimed she saw Moses being brought back half dead. She claimed Whitfield ordered the overseers to hang him. She claimed George was involved. George felt the back of his jaw tighten, but his face remained calm. Whitfield explained that Miriam had fled and now hid somewhere near the swamp. The patrols had searched but found nothing. George knew that if Miriam reached certain people in Tuscaloosa, the story would spread farther. No lie would be strong enough to hold it back. He decided to deal with the problem himself. That night, George left Riverside quietly with only a lantern and a horse. He traveled south along the marsh path where the earth grew soft under the hooves. He listened carefully. Frogs croaked. Water moved. Wind hissed through the trees. He followed a trail of broken branches and muddy footprints. After nearly an hour, he found a small abandoned cabin. The roof sagged, and the door hung crooked, but he saw light moving inside. He tied his horse and walked silently. Inside, Miriam sat close to a dying fire with 2 other runaway slaves. Their faces showed exhaustion and fear. Miriam held her hands over the flames as if trying to warm a soul that had grown frozen. George listened from outside. She spoke about Moses. She spoke about justice. She spoke about telling the sheriff. He heard every word. He stepped inside gently. The moment she saw him she froze. Her breath caught. She whispered one word. You. George knelt beside her as if offering comfort. He spoke softly. He told her she misunderstood. He told her he wanted to help. His voice was smooth as silk. His tone warm as a summer evening. But Miriam did not believe him. She backed away. She raised a wooden stick as a weapon. Her fear filled the tiny cabin like smoke. The other runaways trembled behind her. George sighed as if disappointed. Then his expression changed. The warmth left his eyes. A new kind of coldness settled there. He moved quickly. Miriam swung the stick but missed. George struck her hard. The others screamed. The lantern fell. Flames licked the dry floorboards. The runaways fled into the night. Miriam collapsed. George dragged her outside before the cabin caught fire completely. He tied her hands and feet. Then he rode back to Riverside with her slung across the saddle like a fallen deer. Whitfield waited at the barn. He saw Miriam and swallowed hard. They both knew what her fate would be. But before Whitfield could speak, George offered a plan. Miriam would not be punished here. Punishment left marks. Marks led to questions. Instead, she would be taken to Holly Ridge. Garrett Lynch would handle the rest. When she disappeared, no one would know where she had gone. No one would link her to Riverside. Whitfield agreed. George left with Miriam the next morning. Every mile they rode, she whispered threats. She cursed him. She promised that her words would outlive his lies. She said Moses would haunt him. George ignored her. But that night, when they made camp near the edge of Sipsey River, something strange happened. As he slept, he heard breathing behind him. Not Miriam, not the wind, something else. Something heavy, slow, deep. He opened his eyes. Standing near the trees was a figure. A shadow. A shape that looked like a man with a rope around his neck. George blinked. The figure faded. He stayed awake until dawn. By the next evening, Miriam arrived at Holly Ridge. Garrett tied her in the yard. She screamed that Moses would return for them all. George did not believe in ghosts. But Holly Ridge did, because later that night, the slaves in the cabins heard footsteps walking through the dirt yard. Slow, heavy, dragging. No one was outside, and yet something moved toward the house. Something that sounded like a chain being pulled across the ground. Part 5, The Night the River Refused Silence. Engaging hook. Some stories fade with time. Some stories get buried with the dead. But a few stories refuse to stay silent. And on the banks of the Sipsey River, something began to speak again. Not with words, not with breath, but with footsteps that soak the earth. Part 5 reveals the night when the river itself became a witness. Part 5, Miriam's Last Stand. Holly Ridge woke before sunrise. A heavy mist crawled over the ground as if the river had stretched its fingers across the soil to warn whoever dared to walk there. Garrett Lynch stepped out of the main house with a sour expression. Sleep had been impossible. He claimed the wind had kept him awake, but the slaves in the cabins knew better. They had heard the footsteps again. Slow, dragging, wet, as if someone walked with water dripping from their clothes. The sound passed by each cabin and stopped near the yard post where Miriam had been tied the night before. Then silence. Now morning light touched the yard, and Miriam still stood tied to the post. She had not slept. Her head drooped, but her eyes were wide open. She whispered constantly, speaking to something only she could see. Garrett approached her with annoyance rather than fear. He told her she would be transported in 2 days. He said she would learn obedience at Holly Ridge. But Miriam looked up and smiled in a way that made Garrett step back. She said the river was awake. She said Moses had crossed it. Garrett slapped her and walked away quickly. Inside the house, George Crow ate a quiet breakfast. His calm expression never changed, but his hands were restless. The night had disturbed him. The breathing sound, the heavy shape near the trees. He still told himself it was imagination, exhaustion, stress, but he could not explain why his horse had refused to step near the river that morning. He called Garrett inside. They had business to discuss. Miriam needed to disappear before anyone traced her to Riverside. George wanted her kept silent. Garrett simply wanted her gone. They agreed she would be transported deeper into the woods that night and hidden until an auction could move her out of state. Outside, the slaves watched the two men through small cabin windows. They whispered fearfully. They avoided the yard. They warned each other not to step near the post. Some claimed they had seen a figure at dawn, a tall shape behind Miriam. Others swore they heard chains sliding across the earth. No one dared to speak loudly. Holly Ridge punished curiosity. By noon, the air grew colder. Strange for summer. Clouds thickened. The wind shifted. Even the birds fell silent. It felt as though the entire land waited for something. Around afternoon, a young boy named Samuel walked toward the well to fetch water. He noticed something odd along the riverbank. Footprints. Deep ones. Too deep for any man to make. They were spaced widely apart, as if whoever left them moved with unnatural weight. The prints led straight from the water toward the yard post. Samuel dropped the bucket and ran back to his cabin. He hid under his blanket and refused to speak. By evening, the sky turned gray and the first hints of rain fell. George prepared his horse. Garrett drank whiskey to calm his nerves. Miriam stood motionless at the post. Her dress soaked from the rain. Her eyes still open, her lips still whispering. George approached her and demanded silence. She only turned her head toward the river. George followed her gaze. Something stood at the edge of the tree line. It did not move. It did not blink. It looked like a man but wrong in shape. Its shoulders slumped forward. Its head tilted unnaturally. A long rope hung from its neck. The figure swayed gently as if caught in a breeze that touched nothing else. George blinked. The figure vanished. He stepped back, heart pounding. But he said nothing to Garrett. He refused to show fear. Night fell quickly. The rain grew heavier. Garrett prepared a small wagon to transport Miriam. George lifted a lantern. They untied Miriam and dragged her toward the wagon. She offered no resistance but continued whispering. George leaned closer and heard the words clearly. "He is not done with you." George shoved her onto the wagon and snapped at Garrett to begin moving. But as they reached the gate, the horses stopped. Their bodies stiffened, their ears pinned back. No matter how hard Garrett pulled the reins, they refused to move. Miriam looked toward the tree line again. Something moved between the shadows. George felt his throat tighten. He ordered Garrett to slap the horses, but the animals trembled violently. Lightning flashed across the sky and illuminated the riverbank. The figure stood there again. Closer now. Its wet clothes clung to its body. Its face was swollen and bruised. A rope cut deep into its neck. Its feet hung inches above the ground, but still it moved forward. George dropped the lantern. Garrett cursed and reached for his pistol. But Miriam screamed the loudest sound Holly Ridge had ever heard. "That is Moses." Garrett fired twice toward the river. Each shot echoed across the field. When the smoke cleared, the figure was gone. But the horses reared violently. The wagon tipped sideways. Garrett fell and struck his head. Miriam rolled into the mud. George grabbed the lantern from the ground and lit it again with shaking hands. Miriam crawled away from him. Mud covered her hands. She moved toward the river as if drawn by an unseen force. George shouted for her to stop. She turned back once, tears mixing with rain. "You cannot hide what you did." Before George could reach her, she ran straight into the dark woods. Her figure vanished between the trees. George and Garrett searched for her for nearly an hour, calling her name, listening for movement. But the woods answered with only rain and distant thunder. Then suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the night. Garrett dropped to his knees. George froze. The scream lasted only a moment before it was cut off sharply. Something had silenced her. Something final. They found Miriam at the riverbank minutes later. Her body lay half submerged in the water. Her face pale. Her eyes wide open. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Her wrists had rope marks. But they had never tied her again. Garrett whispered that she must have fallen. George stared at the river and said nothing. Rain poured over his face, but his hands shook in a way he could not hide. Behind them, the footprints appeared again. Fresh, deep, leading toward the water. And this time, there were two sets. One going in, one coming out. Part 6, the night Holly Ridge stopped breathing. Engaging hook. Some places hold fear. Some places create fear. But Holly Ridge was different. It began to breathe fear back into the world. Tonight's chapter reveals the moment the land itself turned against its owner. If you thought Moses's shadow was the only thing haunting this place, you are not ready for what comes next. Part 6, Garrett Lynch hears the dead. The morning after Miriam's death felt wrong from the moment the sun tried to rise. The sky stayed gray. A thick fog smothered the entire property. Even the trees drooped under a weight that was not wind or rain. It felt like sorrow had soaked into the ground overnight. Garrett Lynch sat on the porch with his whiskey bottle clutched in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands refused to stay still. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her scream again. He told himself it was only the river at night. He told himself she fell. He told himself the marks on her wrists meant nothing. But he kept looking toward the woods, waiting to see that tall, soaked figure with the rope around its neck. Inside the main house, George Crow ate in silence, listening to Garrett mutter to himself outside. George's calm face did not show fear. But he felt it. He felt it deep in his bones. He had not slept, not even for a moment. Every sound in the house reminded him of Moses. A chair creaking, a footstep that was not his. The slow drip of water even though the roof did not leak. But George refused to believe in spirits. Spirits did not break necks. Spirits did not leave footprints. Someone was trying to frighten them. That explanation made sense. At least that is what George kept telling himself. By midday, the fog thickened into a blanket so dense that Garrett could not see the yard from the porch. The slaves in the cabins whispered prayers. The fog felt alive. It curled around cabin doors. It crawled under the cracks. It dulled the sunlight until the entire world looked like the inside of a storm cloud. Everything was quiet, and then the sound began. It came from the river first. A slow dragging noise. Wet, heavy, as if someone was pulling a chain through mud. Garrett stood. His heartbeat shook his whole body. The sound drew closer. Across the field, through the fog, toward the porch. Garrett backed up until his spine hit the door. He called out for George. His voice cracked with panic. George stepped onto the porch with a lantern, his jaw tight. They listened. Drag. Stop. Drag. Stop. Garrett swallowed and whispered the name neither man wanted to say. Moses. George snapped that it was only an animal. A large one. Maybe a wounded cow from a nearby farm. But his voice trembled. The fog shifted, and a shape became visible. Tall, still, human. George lifted the lantern higher. The shape vanished instantly. He cursed and marched into the fog, convinced the shape was a runaway slave hiding near the woods. Garrett stayed frozen on the porch. He refused to step down onto the ground. Not after what he saw last night. George called out into the fog, demanding whoever was out there show themselves. His voice echoed strangely as if the air was too thick to carry it. No answer. He walked farther until the house disappeared behind him. The fog swallowed everything. George stopped. He could not tell where the cabins were or the river. The world was white. Then he heard a voice. George. The voice was behind him. George spun around, lantern shaking. No one stood there. Then the voice spoke again. Closer. George. This time it came from the ground. From the soil beneath his shoes. His breath caught. He stepped backward and the earth felt soft, too soft, as if something moved under it. He looked down. A footprint appeared in the mud. Not his. Fresh. Deep. Another one formed beside it. Then another. A line of footprints led away from him. Toward the river. George swallowed hard. Someone was playing tricks. Someone wanted him afraid. He followed the prints, forcing himself to calm down. But the prints led him to something he did not expect. Garrett's wagon. The same wagon that tipped over last night. The same wagon they had not moved. It now sat upright, perfectly positioned at the edge of the woods. Mud coated the wheels. Water dripped from the seat, as if someone had driven it through the river. George felt the cold fingers of fear crawl up his spine. Then he heard a whisper very close. "You cannot outrun what you created." George froze. His heart hammered. He turned, slowly. No one was there. And then he saw something that stole the air from his lungs. The rope they had used to tie Miriam to the post hung from a tree branch above him. The knot swung gently. Mud covered the fibers. The rope was cut halfway through, as if torn from someone's wrists. And the ground beneath it was disturbed. Freshly disturbed, as if something had crawled out. George stumbled backward. His breath became fast. This was impossible. All of it. The rope, the wagon, the footprints. It could not be real. But the ground moved. The soil rose slightly. George dropped his lantern and ran. Back at the main house, Garrett paced the porch like a trapped animal. His eyes darted toward the fog every few seconds. He whispered Moses's name again and again as if saying it would somehow protect him. Then he heard a soft thump beneath the porch boards. He froze. Another thump. Then a slow dragging sound. Garrett stepped back until he hit the door. The thumping grew louder, more desperate. Something was under the house. Something trying to get out. Garrett bolted inside and slammed the door. He shouted for George, but George was nowhere in sight. Garrett grabbed his pistol and aimed at the floor. The boards creaked, then broke. A soaked hand reached through. Gray skin, mud packed under the fingernails. Rope burn across the wrist. Garrett screamed and fired. The hand slipped back under the floor. The fog outside vibrated as if the shot had disturbed it. Garrett stumbled backward. He crashed into the kitchen table. His breath came in shallow bursts. He rushed to the window. Something stood in the yard. Tall, wet, shoulders bent, rope hanging from its neck. Garrett fired again. The shape vanished into the fog. He dropped the gun. His hands shook uncontrollably. The house door opened behind him. He turned, but it was not George. Part 7. The Man Who Wouldn't Let Go. Hook. Some people say the dead stay where they fall. But at Riverside Plantation, the dead followed you. They watched you. And sometimes, when the moon was thin, they tried to speak. Night at Riverside had always been unsettling, but during the summer of 1852 it felt different in a way Moses could not explain. The air hung heavy, sticky, and full of strange whispers that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. A feeling that something old had awakened. Something angry. After the punishment that nearly killed him, Moses returned to his work, even though his back burned every time he moved. The scars were deep and painful, but not as painful as the memories of betrayal. Still, he kept silent, because silence was all he had left. Whitfield watched him closely, always looking for signs of rebellion. The overseers kept their rifles loaded. But even they avoided the cemetery at night. Everyone avoided the cemetery, except Moses. Every night after his work was done, after the tools were cleaned and the fires in the forge died down, Moses walked to the cemetery where his mother was buried. It was the only place where he felt like a man and not an object. It was the only place where he could breathe without fear. The tall cedar trees swayed softly as he knelt near her grave. He whispered to her, words he shared with nobody else. He believed she listened. He believed she understood. One night, while kneeling near the grave, he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy, dragging. Moses froze. No overseer walked like that. No living man did. He turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. Just the moonlight falling on rows of old stones. The sound stopped. Then it began again, this time closer. Moses backed away, but the footsteps faded as quickly as they had come. He told himself it was his imagination. He told himself the pain and exhaustion were playing tricks on him. But deep inside he knew the truth. The dead were not resting. Over the following days, strange things began happening around the plantation. Tools went missing and later appeared in strange places. Buckets of water tipped over on their own. Doors creaked open even when there was no wind. A cold chill lingered in rooms that had no windows. And every time something happened, the slaves whispered the same name. Moses. They believed Moses had brought something back with him when he returned from his near death. Some said that because he had been close to crossing over, the spirits followed him. Others said he carried a curse from the graveyard itself. Moses denied it every time, but even he began to feel a shadow following him. Whitfield noticed the change too. He became crueler, more suspicious, more violent. He blamed Moses for everything that went wrong, even when the proof made no sense. One night, a storage barn door burst open on its own, the wood splintering as if ripped apart by giant hands. No slave had touched it. The overseers were terrified. Whitfield turned his rage toward Moses. He was brought to the big house for questioning. The hall smelled like old wood and expensive tobacco. Candlelight flickered on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Whitfield leaned forward. "Something is wrong with this place," he said. "It started when you came back. You think I do not see it, but I do. You brought darkness with you." Moses remained silent. Anything he said would be twisted and used against him. Whitfield's voice dropped to a whisper. "You will tell me what you brought back, or I will cut it out of you." Before the threat could continue, the candles flickered and went out. All at once, the room fell into darkness. Whitfield froze. The overseers stepped back, gripping their guns. A cold wind passed through the room, though all the windows were closed. Something moved behind Moses. A soft dragging sound, a scraping across the wooden floor. Whitfield lit a lantern with shaking hands. The flame sputtered, struggling to stay alive. When the light grew, the room appeared normal again. But the overseers refused to stay. They demanded to leave the house, saying the place was cursed. Whitfield yelled at them, but they would not listen. Fear had taken over. That night, Moses was locked in a small storage shed near the fields. Whitfield said he would deal with him in the morning. But Moses was not worried about Whitfield. He feared the thing that walked behind him. The thing he had heard in the cemetery. The thing that now followed him everywhere he went. Inside the shed, the darkness pressed in from all sides. The silence was painful. Moses tried to sleep but could not. Hours passed. Then he heard it. The footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Heavy. The same as before. They circled the shed, then stopped at the door. Moses held his breath. Something pressed against the wood. The boards creaked as if pushed by invisible hands. The door rattled. Then a whisper came through the cracks. A dry whisper. A voice without breath. "Free me." Moses backed away until he hit the wall. The whisper came again. "Free me." He recognized the voice. It was a voice he had not heard in years. A voice he wished he had forgotten. It was the voice of Robert, a slave who had died under Whitfield's punishment long before Moses arrived. Robert had been beaten and buried in the cemetery. And now he was calling to Moses. The whisper grew louder. "They cannot escape. The ground is full of us. We wait, we watch, and we know you hear us." The shed grew colder. Moses could see his breath. Shadows moved across the walls even though there was no light. The footsteps began, again, circling the room, slow and steady. Moses covered his ears but the whispers went on. "Free us. Free us all." Just before dawn, the voices stopped. The cold vanished. Moses fell to the floor, too weak to move. When the sun rose, the overseers opened the shed and stepped back in horror. The walls were covered in finger marks. Hundreds of them. Scratches running from floor to ceiling like desperate hands clawing for escape. Moses had done none of it. But everyone knew who the spirits had come for. And everyone knew they were not finished. If you want, I can continue with part 8 in the same style. Part 8. The night the bells rang. Hook. On a silent night at Riverside Plantation, something happened that no one could explain. The church bell began ringing by itself. And every time it rang, someone whispered that another spirit had awakened. The sun had barely risen when the news spread across the plantation. The finger marks on the shed walls had frightened everyone, even the overseers who pretended not to believe in ghosts. They whispered among themselves, glancing at Moses with fear and suspicion. No one wanted to work near him. No one even wanted to speak his name. They said his shadow moved differently. They said he walked with the dead. Moses did not argue. He was too tired to defend himself. The voices he heard the night before still echoed in his mind. Robert's whisper lingered like a cold hand on his shoulder. "Free us. Free us all." It felt less like a request and more like a command. Whitfield, however, was furious. He refused to believe in anything supernatural. To him the scratches on the walls were proof that Moses was dangerous. He thought Moses had carved those marks to scare people. He believed Moses was trying to create rebellion. So Whitfield ordered tighter watch, stronger chains at night, and harsher punishment for anyone caught whispering about ghosts. But even Whitfield could not explain what happened after sunset. That evening the air felt strange. The wind stopped blowing. The trees stood still as if waiting for something. The animals refused to move. Even the cicadas were silent. The entire plantation felt held under a giant, breathless pause. And then, from the far end of the fields, came a sound that froze every heart. The old church bell began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. The bell had not been touched in years. The small church had been abandoned and locked. Even the overseers avoided it because people said a slave woman had died inside during a storm. No one dared to go near it after dark. But tonight the bell rang with a force that shook the rafters. The sound reached every cabin. People came out of their homes, eyes wide, heads turned toward the church. Some knelt, some cried. The elders whispered that the dead were calling for justice. Mothers held their children close, covering their ears to keep them from hearing the next ring. Whitfield stormed out of his house, his face red with rage and fear. He yelled at the overseers to follow him. They grabbed their guns even though they knew bullets were useless against spirits. Moses stood among the others, staring at the distant church tower. A chill ran down his spine. Every time the bell rang, he felt a pulse inside his chest. A message, a warning, or maybe a memory, he could not be sure. Whitfield shouted at the crowd. "Who is doing this? Which one of you is trying to scare me? Speak before I make you speak." No one moved. No one spoke. And then the bell rang again. Whitfield spun toward the sound. He grabbed a lantern and marched toward the church. The overseers followed him, though their steps were shaky and fearful. Moses felt something pulling at him. A silent tug deep inside his bones. He knew he had to go, too, so he followed behind the others, keeping distance, moving quietly through the night. The church sat at the edge of the plantation, half hidden by towering trees whose branches tangled like skeletal fingers. The wooden frame was old and beginning to rot. The windows were cracked. The bell tower leaned slightly to one side as if tired from holding so many secrets. Whitfield pushed open the church doors. They creaked loudly, a long and painful sound like something waking from a deep sleep. The lantern light revealed rows of dusty pews, a broken altar, and thick cobwebs hanging like curtains. The air inside was cold. Colder than outside. The overseers kept close to Whitfield, their guns trembling in their hands. The bell rang again, but this time it was not from the tower. It came from inside the church. The sound bounced off the walls, sharp and metallic. Whitfield turned in circles, trying to find the source. The overseers stepped back, their faces pale. Moses stood in the doorway, feeling the same cold wind that touched him in the shed. Something moved behind the altar. Something slow, something heavy. Whitfield raised his lantern. "Show yourself." The light flickered. The shadows grew darker. Then Moses saw it. A figure stood behind the altar. Not fully formed, more shadow than man. Its head bowed, its arms long and thin. The outline of its body shimmered like smoke trapped in a human shape. Its presence filled the entire room with a deep, ancient sorrow. The figure lifted its head. Moses recognized the face. Robert, the slave who had died years ago. The one who had been beaten, buried, forgotten. His eyes glowed with a faint white light. His mouth opened but no breath came out. Still Moses understood the message. "He is coming." The overseers screamed and ran out of the church. Whitfield turned pale but did not move. The lantern slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, sending fire across the wooden boards. Flames climbed the walls but Robert's spirit did not move. It stood still, staring straight at Moses. The bell rang again, so loud the roof trembled. Moses turned to run. The flames spread quickly, licking the pews, devouring the dry wood. Whitfield finally gained control of his legs and pushed past Moses, desperate to escape the burning church. Outside, people watched the flames rise into the sky. Children cried. Elders prayed. The fire roared like a living thing. Whitfield collapsed in the dirt, gasping and shaking. When the bell tower finally caught fire, the bell rang one last time before crashing down with a thunderous roar. Everyone stepped back. Everyone stared. But Moses could not move. His eyes were fixed on the burning doorway. And for a moment, in the rising flames, he saw Robert standing there. Not burning, not afraid, just watching him. The figure slowly lifted a hand and pointed toward the cemetery. Then it vanished in the smoke. The message was clear. This was not the end. This was the beginning. If you want, I can continue with part 9 in the same style. Part 9. The Cemetery That Woke Up. Hook. On the night the church burned to the ground, every grave in the old slave cemetery shifted. Some say the earth rose. Some say the dead were trying to breathe again. The flames of the burning church lit up the sky long into the night. The smoke curled upward like dark spirits rising from the roof, drifting across fields, cabins, and the river itself. People on the plantation stayed awake, terrified. Mothers rocked their children. Work halted. No one dared to sleep. Moses sat alone outside his cabin, staring at the red glow on the horizon. He could still feel Robert's cold presence, still hear the echo in his mind. He is coming. The warning clung to him like frost. He did not know who Robert meant. Whitfield, George Crow, or something far worse. In the distance the bell tower collapsed with a deep cracking sound. Embers shot into the sky like fireflies escaping a cage. The light briefly illuminated the fields. And that was when Moses saw something that made his blood run cold. The ground near the cemetery moved. He blinked, thinking his mind was playing tricks. But then it happened again. A slow, trembling shift as if something beneath the earth was pushing upward. A small puff of dust lifted, then settled again. He stood. His legs felt weak, but something inside him urged him forward. The same silent pull that had led him to the church. The same whisper that had called his name in the shed. He walked through the dark, avoiding the overseers who still paced nervously around the cabins. The closer he came to the cemetery, the colder the air became. The trees here were twisted, their branches pointing like bony fingers. The moon cast long shadows across the worn gravestones. Then he saw it clearly. The earth around his mother's grave had cracked open. Moses stopped. His heart pounded. The night seemed to hold its breath. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully. He knelt beside the grave. The soil was loose, disturbed, as if something had clawed upward from below. He whispered her name, Sarah. A faint breeze brushed across his cheek, though the air was still. He felt a tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had as a child when she held him close during storms. A strange warmth filled him, but it was wrapped around deep sadness. Then the whisper came, Moses. He jerked back. The voice came from the earth itself. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frightening. It was soft, tired, and full of longing. Moses stared at the cracked soil, tears misting his eyes. He reached out and touched the top of the grave. I'm here, he whispered. The earth shifted again. A small piece of broken wood pushed upward. Moses realized it was the edge of the coffin. The whisper came again. Find them. He froze. Find who? He looked around the cemetery. The graves of children. The graves of men who had been beaten. The graves of women who had died giving birth. He saw them all. Their spirits felt close. Too close. Then he understood. The missing ones. The slaves who had been taken quietly. The rebels who vanished from plantations. The people George Crow had sent to Holly Ridge. The ones who disappeared into the dark forest and were never seen again. Robert had said he is coming. Now his mother said find them. The pieces connected like cold stones falling into place. Holly Ridge. The abandoned property. The farm no one used. The place where Lynch worked under George's orders. A place that was never marked on slave records. A place rumored only in whispers. Moses stood. His heart raced with fear, but also with something else. A strange force. A rising determination. The spirits were not calling him to hide. They were calling him to see the truth. He looked back at the cabins. Most of the slaves were gathered outside, staring at the fire, praying, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. He could not tell them yet. He had to see it himself first. He walked a few steps away from the cemetery, but then stopped when he saw a dark figure standing among the gravestones. At first he thought it was an overseer. But no overseer would come here willingly. The figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight across his bones. Moses recognized him. Samuel, a young man who had vanished 6 months ago after speaking out about Whitfield's brutal punishments. People had believed he escaped. They hoped he had reached freedom. But here he was, pale as moonbeams, staring at Moses with blank eyes. Samuel lifted his arm and pointed toward the forest. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as if pulled by invisible strings. The cold wind returned, swirling around them. Moses swallowed hard. "I know," he said. "I'm going." Samuel lowered his arm slowly, his form fading into the darkness until he vanished completely. Moses rubbed his hands together, trying to calm the shaking inside him. He felt the spirits gathering behind him, not angry, but watching. He walked back toward the cabins. The overseers ignored him, too distracted by the burning church. Whitfield was inside his house, drinking heavily, pacing in circles, shouting at shadows. The fire had broken something inside him. He had seen the figure in the church. He knew he saw Robert. And he knew it was connected to Moses. That made Moses's mission even more dangerous. When he entered his cabin, he found Ruth sitting on his bed. She had wide eyes, her breath quick, her face pale with fear. "Moses," she whispered. The children heard something outside their window. Someone calling your name, over and over. Moses felt a chill. "Did you see who it was?" Ruth shook her head. "No, but I heard the word Holly. Over and over, like someone was choking on the last part. Holly Ridge." The spirits were not waiting. They were pushing. Moses stepped inside and closed the door. Ruth grabbed his arm. "You're not going alone," she said. Her voice was trembling but firm. Moses looked at her. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to protect her. But he remembered the voices. "Find them. He is coming." It was too big for one person. He nodded. "We leave before sunrise," he said. "And we do not tell anyone." Outside, a crow landed on the cabin roof. It stared at Moses with a single cold eye. Then it cawed sharply and flew toward the northern forest. The path to Holly Ridge. The night was far from over. If you want, I can continue with part 10, the final part, in the same style. Part 10. Shadows over Holly Ridge. Hook. The forest never sleeps. At Holly Ridge, the cries of the lost still echo. And when the moon rises, even the living can hear the whispers of those who never escaped. Moses moved quietly through the dense forest, the shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trees leaned in, their branches like skeletal fingers trying to scratch at his coat. Somewhere in the distance, the Black Warrior River gurgled, calm and indifferent, hiding the secrets of those who had disappeared into its waters. He had only one goal: Holly Ridge. The plantation had become a tomb disguised as a farm, a place where the screams of the broken were buried beneath forced labor and shadowed deals. He could feel the weight of all the souls lost to George Crow pressing against him as he walked, urging him forward. The first sign that something was wrong came as he approached the outer fields. The fences, old and rusted, were barely standing. Chains hung from the posts like grim decorations. Footprints marked the muddy paths, but they were not fresh. Too many prints, overlapping, leading to and from the buildings. Something had already moved here. Moses pressed on, staying low. The main house of Holly Ridge loomed ahead, dark against the moonlight. No smoke rose from the chimneys. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. But he knew better. He had heard the whispers in the cemetery, felt the tug of the spirits guiding him. Holly Ridge was alive in a way few could survive. Inside, the air was thick with decay and sweat. The smell of rotting wood mixed with faint traces of iron. The first room he entered was empty, but chains rattled softly from the ceiling. He froze. Every nerve in his body screamed. Then a voice, faint," whispered Moses. He turned sharply. A small child appeared from the shadows, eyes wide, trembling. She was no older than 8, thin, with hair falling in matted clumps. He recognized her immediately from the rumors he had heard, a child sold years ago who had disappeared into Holly Ridge. "Follow me," Moses whispered. The girl hesitated, then nodded. She led him through a maze of rooms and halls, each darker than the last. Occasionally, they passed a figure slumped against the wall, unresponsive, but breathing. The living dead of Holly Ridge. Broken slaves who had been stripped of everything but their bodies. Moses realized the full scale of George Crow's cruelty. Not just profit. Not just capturing rebels. This was a factory of despair. Every brick, every chain, every tool had a purpose. And George had mastered it all, using fear and patience instead of brute force alone. The girl led him to the final building, a small brick structure near the edge of the property. Inside, dozens of children and adults were held together, too weak to resist, too afraid to speak. Their eyes followed him like flickering candles in a dark room. He knelt, trying to reassure them. "You will leave here, I promise you." The whisper returned, louder this time. "Hurry, he is coming." Moses froze. He knew the sound. The soft, calculated steps of George Crow. Crow had been waiting. He had anticipated that someone might come. He always anticipated. The door opened, and George stepped in, calm, unhurried, dressed like a gentleman, his dark eyes cold as ice. "Moses," he said, smiling faintly. "I wondered when you would arrive." Moses stood his ground, his fists clenched. "Leave them alone, Crow. You cannot keep them." George laughed, a low, dangerous sound that filled the room. "Keep them? No, Moses. I do not keep them. I refine them, shape them, prepare them, like a blacksmith with iron. You understand iron, do you not? It must be heated, bent, hammered, or it will break. I merely apply the same principle to people." Moses's jaw tightened. Every word confirmed what he had feared. George was not just cruel. He was proud of it. And he knew no bounds. George stepped closer. "You cannot stop me. You are free, yes. But they are mine, and they always will be. Freedom is a luxury, Moses, and I am in the business of controlling luxuries." Moses scanned the room. Children huddled in corners. Adults, hollow-eyed, whispered in fear. He could not let this happen. He thought quickly. He remembered the cemetery, the spirits, the force that had guided him here. He whispered a prayer, a silent plea for courage. Then he acted. He grabbed a small lantern, tipped it toward the barrels of pitch and straw stacked in the corner. A spark caught, flames rose, and fire spread rapidly. George recoiled, startled by the sudden chaos. The fire lit the room with dancing orange and yellow shadows. Smoke filled the air. People began coughing, but Moses guided them toward the rear door. They ran through the dark fields, smoke at their backs, fire illuminating the horror of the plantation. Chains and broken tools littered the ground, evidence of the years of torment. But they ran, guided by Moses, toward freedom. George stood in the doorway of Holly Ridge, furious but unable to follow. His empire was burning, and for the first time, his control slipped. The people he had once ruled with fear now escaped in the chaos. The group reached the forest line, hearts pounding, lungs burning, but alive. The spirits whispered around them, guiding them northward, toward the river, toward hope. Moses led them, silent and determined. Each step was heavy, but each step was a victory over the man who had profited from their pain for so long. By dawn, the fire had consumed most of Holly Ridge. Smoke rose like a dark column into the sky, visible for miles. Slaves and freed people watched from the forest edge. Some cried, some whispered thanks. Moses simply stared at the burning property, knowing that George Crow's shadow would always linger. Yet hope remained. Children who had once been lost were now safe. Adults who had been broken were now free to walk again, even if the scars of Holly Ridge never faded. And Moses understood that even in the darkest places, courage and determination could ignite change. George Crow would survive, perhaps, lurking in the shadows, waiting for new victims. But tonight, his power had faltered. Tonight, the voices of the dead had guided the living to freedom. Moses took a deep breath. The Black Warrior River shimmered in the morning light. Freedom was not easy, not simple, but it was real. And that reality was worth more than any promise, any prophet, any chain. As they walked away, the wind carried one last whisper. Not of fear, not of sorrow, but of warning. A promise that the past could not be erased, that memory would endure, and that those who survived had the power to tell the truth. If you felt the weight of Holly Ridge and the shadow of George Crow, make sure to subscribe to the channel to uncover more hidden stories from history. Share this story with friends so the voices of the past are not forgotten. Comment below what you think happened to the spirits of Holly Ridge and who you believe survived the horrors of George Crow's empire.